Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Coder Career, a special episode of the Coder Career. Because those of you who are listening, or dare I say, watching on Spotify and YouTube, you can suddenly see two incredibly handsome men being beamed to you from the central belt of Scotland. I am, of course, joined by Colin. How are you doing, Colin?
I'm great. This is a really cool format. I'm quite excited for this episode, and I'm looking forward to the conversation as well.
Yeah,
Should be
I'm
really
super
good.
excited, and do forgive any technical mistakes because we're obviously new to this, and any feedback as well is totally welcome. We'd also really encourage people to watch this on YouTube as well, just to try and get a bit of traction on there relative to our other videos as well, because we're really trying to push that at the moment. And something I've been really loving actually is Colin's recent video where he explains several concepts around APIs using a burrito, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, the good old burrito. The burrito's going to become the mascot of the coder career, I think, to be honest with you.
Burritos and Earl the cat. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's like a cool little burrito game actually that I've been planning on getting a hold of for quite a while. I don't know what you do in it, but like it's one of those board games where you like take the burrito and then you throw it or something. Have you
Do
seen
you,
that one?
do you know what? I played that in Belgium with my girlfriend's family, and we're all wearing socks on a hardwood floor. And I can't remember who. It was either my girlfriend or one of her sisters slipped and properly banged her head while we were playing. So if four people in their 20s have managed that, I don't know how kids would fare on it as well. But yeah, I'm sure it's fun. I don't really remember the details of the game. Maybe it was me and I took a bang on the head and I don't remember.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of fun. I want to get one of those burritos as a mascot anyway, and like stick it up in my shelf there next to like a bunch of other stuff that I've got. So yeah, should be fun.
You make me hungry, man. I need to get down to Fresh Max. Yeah, shout out Fresh Max on Lothian Road. Those who know. Anyway, so this week we figured because this is kind of a test episode in terms of the video format, we've got a few things like if one of us makes a great joke, we have like this. Hopefully that came through. Oh, I hit it twice. That's how funny it was. So we're gonna try and keep this one a little bit more informal. And the theme of this week is actually just what we think is cool in tech right now. And you can really just think of this episode as imagine me and Colin having a beer down one of the many fine establishments in Edinburgh, and you've just got a mic to us as well. So yeah, that's basically where we're started. So I guess who better to hand over to Colin? What are you excited about right now in the world of software?
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited for this chat. It's just going to be like a little tech chat, which I think is always quite fun to hear what people are thinking. So, yeah, one of the things I'm really loving at the moment, and I'm doing a lot of it, like both in work and outside work, is the Next. Just absolutely loving Next, and we done our episode on Next.js uh, a while back there. Like there was a last episode all about Next and server-side rendering. I just can't get enough of it. I think it's absolutely tremendous. So if you haven't watched or listened to that episode, please go back and give it a listen. And there was a couple of little things on that episode that we never had time to shout out to. And one of the things that's really cool, and we've just started building the Coder Career blog using this. It's a thing called MDX. It's like a really cool tool that works with Next, and you give it like a Markdown file, and then what you can do is that it takes that Markdown file and like just turns that into it statically renders that as like an HTML file, and then that becomes your page, which is like really cool. And there's like a few other kind of frameworks that do that, and like a few other tools that do that. But it's quite nice to be able to do it in Next. Have you heard of that MDX?
Yeah, well, I mean, only since you told me about it, but having
Yeah.
seen what you've been able to do with it, it is really exciting, and it's a nice kind of like light way of adding content to your website. Like, for example, if someone's got a personal, I know a lot of people that have a personal website where maybe, for example, they're listed. I'm rebuilding my personal website right now, and I'm thinking about
Mm.
listing my podcast appearances, like not just Code a Career, but obviously I've guested around. If like I was on All the Code a couple of months ago, for instance, it's stuff like that that I'm thinking about adding to my personal website. But I don't need something like Contentful for that. Especially because I'm a developer myself. Just like merge it in using MDX. So I think it's very cool. And I like what you've done. I'm pleased that you put me on it actually because I think you can get a lot done with it.
Yeah, it's really cool. The thing that blows my mind about it is just it's like it's not just Markdown for Next. It's not just a case of like It's not just a case of like take the Markdown file and turns it into HTML and sticks it on your next app. It's more like actually what it does is and you can then bake React components into the rendered next like stuff. It's so cool. So if you've got like some statically generated like Markdown stuff that's like a document or a blog page, if you want to stick a React component in there, you can, and MDX lets you do that, and it just then client side renders that chunk, or even server side renders it if there's nothing dynamically going on. So it's just really really cool. I absolutely love it, and I can't wait to like explore and do more with it. And it reminded me of something that I saw recently, like another new framework. And there's loads of new framework called Astro,
I was just about to
and
bring
it's
Astro up. Yeah.
yeah. I had a feeling you might. On you go.
Well, no, I mean, it sounds like you may have read more than me, but the real advantage of Astro is just how lightweight it is, and I think it's kind of someone was saying, and I think it's funny. I mentioned Order Code a minute ago. I think I was listening to Order Code the other day, and they were saying like if you don't need all the use cases that Next has, like if you want something that's purely front end, like I think they were saying it's websites versus web apps. And I think that's what Astro is amazing at. Like it's absolutely rapid, very quick. And I think as well, I believe it's framework agnostic. So it's not like you're tied into React or something. I think you can use Angular or you can use Vue or Svelte, which I think is great as well. So, it's something, it could be the king of if you want to make something small and rapid, it could be the way forward because, these full stack frameworks like Next and Remix are the two big ones. And I believe there's one called Fresh, which is built on top of Dino as well. But they are really great, but they're pretty heavyweight. Whereas if you have something that is just great for your front end only, something like Astro seems like it could be really exciting.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I mean, I've not had a chance to look into it at all in detail. Like I read a little bit about it, watched a couple of videos on the YouTubes, and uh, yeah, it seems really cool. Like as you say, it's language agnostic, which I don't quite understand how that's going to work yet, but it will be really fun to see how that pans out. But its main feature is basically that it supports it's like websites, as you say. It takes that whole rendering things to the extreme and says, actually, this is kind of going back to how we used to build websites and just have static HTML files, but
Mm.
then it gives you the dynamic part, like um in each script tag, which is pretty cool. I don't quite fully understand it yet, but it's one to watch out for. Put it that way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we're talking like marketing websites, personal
Yeah,
portfolios, and personal websites, I think it's that kind of use cases. It's like, really, do you need much of a back end to your personal website? I don't think so.
yeah.
Like, I think the one I'm building at the moment literally has no back end. I think I have some kind of like Mailchimp integration where, if you want to like keep abreast with what I'm doing, then you can basically submit to the mail list, and I'll let you know if anyone cares. So yeah,
Nice.
that's basically what I'm building, and it doesn't need. I think I am building it in Remix just because I like Remix, but it doesn't need to be that heavy. I mean, I could try and do that thing that Fireship does, where he rebuilds the same thing 10 times, but I don't know if I don't know for the sake of my sanity if I could do that.
He's got enough time. He's got clearly got the time though, right? I mean, like that's his whole entire job. So, um, I think as well. Like I was going to just point out, like on a sort of like little bit of side note, which is really interesting for me, is like Next and this whole movement, like back to server side rendering and Astro and all these like projects and Remix and all the Vue stuff that's going to be that's now moving to server side rendering, and like it's really interesting because it's it's just more evidence that like the way that we build stuff over a long period of time is cyclical. So like for example, if we go back to like when I first the very very first piece of HTML I ever like wrote was you write it on a text editor, and then you like use an FTP client to like upload it to your server, and then like the web server takes that HTML and then just like it literally just serves it. It just says when someone gets this HTML file, they grab the HTML and it gets sent to their client, and the client their browser just like renders the HTML. And that's kind of how we built websites years ago. We would just literally just hand write HTML, and and then we moved away from that. Then I think called MVC came along, Model View Controller. There's this idea that what you do is you write HTML, but then you like template like little bits of it. So for example, if I want to have like a list of names that are like coming to my meetup, like in inside my like little web page, then what I'll do is you have like a little template language, and then you'll have like a for loop, and then it'll grab the stuff from the database, and then it'll like stick it in that HTML file like on the back end, and it'll technically server side render it. That's what it was doing back then, but we just didn't call it server side rendering because we hadn't been through the obsession with client side rendering that we've had, so and then it would like generate an HTML file on the server, and then it would send that back, and it would do that per request. And then we were like, nah, screw this. This is like, oh, this is not a good way to do it. And we went down the route of like client side rendering everything. And we've got a whole episode on React if you want to listen to me talk more about like that stuff, and let us chat about that. And then next comes along and goes, actually, let's take what we learned with React, and let's take what we learned like in the old school way of doing it, and like stick them together and make it so that we get the best of both. And I really like how things are. Nothing ever changes, basically. Like it's nothing's. There's nothing new about this stuff, which is quite nice. But it feels new because it's done in a modern way, and we now have the benefit of like knowing how to do all this cool JavaScript bundling that we didn't know how to do before. So there's just tons of really cool benefits to these kind of cyclical, nothing ever changes type things.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if one trend that could come back is how programming used to be much more verbose in terms of like I can't think of the right word, but like keywords, I guess. Like think of something like COBOL, which is still one of the best ways to make money, mainly because everyone that wrote it is now retired. So I absolutely love these stories. These people that like retired 15 years ago and are now coming back into the workplace and getting absolutely paid. I love that. But it was much more, from what I understand, COBOL was far more verbose, much more like writing, a natural language like English or whatever. So I wonder if we could end up going back towards that, but I don't know. Could happen. Maybe because people might see it as more accessible, but then the counter argument is if it's all in English anyway, it's not accessible for people who don't have English as their first language. So that's an interesting one. Whether it will come around or not, I don't know. I don't know how much desire there is for that. Really, I mean, what do you think?
I mean, like by verbose, do you mean like more like English, and like not as language syntax heavy or expression heavy, or
Yeah, so verbose as in like just explaining. So I can't think of a good example, but on a small level, I know like Golang, the function keyword
mm,
is fun, whereas
mm,
JavaScript it's function. So
yeah.
just something like that in that vein, I would consider the JavaScript keyword more verbose than the Golang keyword. I can't think of the. I mean, I don't know COBOL, unfortunately. So otherwise, I would be going into a bank and earning $3,000 a day. Uh, but yeah, that's the kind of direction I'm talking about. I wonder if it could go that way to be more accessible because people want ease of use. But now that I'm talking about it, maybe actually if English is a second language, of course, it's not going to be easy at all. So maybe not.
I think talking about programming programming, the future of programming, and like the kind of where it's all going to go. I think things are probably going to get a lot less verbose, actually, potentially, because things are gonna start. We're going to start to use Rust a lot more. We're going to start to use low level programming languages a lot more in the future than we have in the past. Like, um, I'm not saying that I think JS is like down or gone or anything like that, but in order to cram and squeeze out more performance out of the client, out of the browser, JS kind of has to evolve somehow, and it might involve in like the way of like WASM, WebAssembly. So WASM is really cool in that you basically write a a programming language, a high level programming language of some kind, and then it compiles it down to um, it's basically like a kind of standard assembly language that most modern browsers, like very modern browsers, can understand. But it's like highly compiled. It's not quite machine code, but it's very close to that, and it can be translated very quickly from the intermediate language that it is to machine code.
Mm.
And
Like something like
there's a lot of
assembly.
yep,
Well, I guess
yep.
hence the
It's
name, right? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's so I don't think if you look at WebAssembly like instructions, like in the compiled form, I don't think they'd look like x86 or ARM, or those are like the chip architectures
Hmm.
for like your computer and your phone. I don't think they'd look like them. Um, it's designed to not be anything like them. I think, but my understanding is that your browser can run that can run those instructions like significantly quicker, and they're significantly closer to the actual bare metal instructions that you're running than like sort of interpreting JavaScript. Um, so there's been really cool like uh, stuff happening with WebAssembly. Um, and for example, what it means is if you can like you can take like a native application. So one of the things that's happened is that the people who do AutoCAD have basically like taken AutoCAD, which I think was written in almost entirely in C++, and it's AutoCAD's like a 3D like modeling um design computer aided design like package for like doing like you know uh blueprint type drawings and industrial type designs and stuff like that. So they took my understanding is that they've taken the C++ source code for like AutoCAD or AutoCAD 3D, and then they've like compiled it with like a WASM compiler to run in the browser, and it runs like really fast on the browser. Whereas if you could basically have never done that with like you could never. It would have taken them years to convert it over to like running using React or something like that. But it only didn't take them anywhere near as long to like build a completely native application and run it in the browser. So I think things are going to get like a lot more verbose, and we're going to have to use a lot more things like Rust, and we're maybe going to have to like there's going to be like an intermediary between like what we're doing with JS and what we're doing with Rust and what we're doing with C++ and C and kind of lower level languages, and they're gonna like converge at some point maybe, which is pretty interesting. Have you heard of the WebAssembly stuff?
Yeah, so I actually, if people want to listen back, this is this is a remarkably good callback. Actually, I did an episode with Billy Williams from Otter, and I think I'm thinking top of my head now. It must be around episode 32. I want to say, and he's quite interested in the whole WebAssembly thing. So people want to check that out, then because he knew far more than me. So it is a really interesting topic, and I think it's funny you bring up Rust in relation to that, because I do think Rust has been really in the at the side, ready to come in to the forefront, in the wings, as it were, because I think it's been consistently top of Stack Overflow surveys for most of language for a long time. And it is, and hold your breath here, Colin. It is absolutely loved in Web3. Uh, which is a like or not is a huge industry in of itself. So it's one of those things that it is getting very close to becoming an absolute huge language. And whilst I doubt either of us would really recommend people learn it off the cuff, if you want to learn it as your first language, I would still, not that I want to speak for you, Colin, but I think we would both agree JavaScript or Python is probably language one. But if you want to pick up another language later on, like say Golang or something like that, maybe Rust is the way to go. Maybe 2 years into your career. I mean, what do you reckon, Colin?
This is like such an interesting segue of the conversation. I was having a chat with some people on LinkedIn the other day about this about, and I taught at for 3 years at a boot camp in Scotland, and yeah, I've gained quite a lot of opinions about what a good first programming language is, and I actually think that a really good first programming language for people to learn would be Java, right? Like And here's my reasoning for this, right? So when you're learning how to write code, you've got to understand a few things. You've got to understand the rules of the language. That's the first thing. You've got to understand the types and how they work, and they'll kind of have a kind of connection to the rules of the language. And then you also have to understand the conventions of the language. So, like for example, like in this language, we do this way. That's what a convention means. And the rules and the rules of a language are often like a little bit different from the conventions of a language. And in interpreted languages, so for example, um, languages like Python, Ruby, and JavaScript, those those tend to not have a stronger type system, and because of that, they have runtime types as they can be referred to. So, like a runtime type is, for example, if I have a Ruby, if I write something in Ruby, if I make a variable in Ruby and I assign it a string, like when I assign that variable a string, that variable becomes a string. If I then reassign that variable to an integer, a number, or a boolean, or something different, that type then changes. So what I learned when teaching people how to program was that I was trying to get them to understand the rules of the language, and I was also trying to get them to understand the type system behind the language. And the type system at that point is essentially entirely in their head, right? Like if I say, you know, um, my variable equals open quotation, colon, close quotation, then that variable becomes a string. If I then say my variable equals number one, that variable then becomes an int. It's really important to get people to understand the type system. But if the type system's not written right there in front of you, you've got to imagine that. So I would start to refer to these as imaginary types, as runtime types, as types that like uh, that are hard to get people to understand. And basically, from teaching those languages to complete beginners, that's really, really, really tough. It's like really hard to like get people to understand the type of that thing is a string because they can't see that written down. They have to imagine that in their head. And then let's say that like they've got a big app with a good few lines of code, like for a beginner anyway, and it calls a few functions. So if I say to someone, what type is that? They have to then trace that back to where it gets assigned. It's a value, which it could be reassigned the value, and it could be reassigned types. In like sort of Ruby and Python, it could be reassigned types like several times, like throughout the execution of that application. And in my experience, that is a real like bit of confusion for beginners. On the flip side, if they can write something that says my variable, which is a string, has this value, then that means that can only ever be a string, and it will have a string, and you can see it written there. And that's called, I know you know this, that's called statically typed languages. It means that when you write the code, you can see that it's a string. You can, because you literally write the word string, and that means that it can own that variable can only ever hold string types. And I think when teaching somebody, and I've taught people from very scratch Python and Ruby, and I've taught people from very scratch Java. In my experience, it's like a complete night and day system. They get the type system so much quicker than they get it if they have to try and imagine the types. So controversially, I think something that has static types is a really, really, really good first language for people to learn because they'll pick it up. They pick up the type system so much quicker.
That's an interesting perspective, because I've never really thought about it that way, and I'm someone that learnt dynamic first, and I think let's segue, and we'll be back in a minute into our sponsor here because I think you've mentioned teaching at the bootcamp, so we're going to hear about Codeclan now, and we'll be back in a second. The Coder Career Podcast is brought to you by Codeclan. As the only coding bootcamp in Scotland, Codeclan is a fantastic way for people in Edinburgh and Glasgow to learn to code in person. And if you're elsewhere in the UK, you can still benefit from their remote cohorts. With over 1,500 graduates, 70% of which get a full-time job within 6 months at one of Codeclan's 390 hiring partners, Codeclan is a fantastic place to make a change in your career. Codeclan is also making great strides towards reducing the gender gap in technology, with over 25% of their alumni now being female, with this rapidly growing. With average starting salaries of around £30,000, a world-class curriculum, and a forward-thinking organisation, Codeclan is the place to be. As a former senior instructor at Codeclan, Colin can tell us even more.
Yeah, absolutely. Codeclan is an absolutely phenomenal place to be, place to work, place to study. It's a coding bootcamp, and it does full-time professional software engineering and data courses. The software engineering course is called the PSD, and the data course is called the PDA. Both these courses are 12 to 16 weeks full-time. They are fully instructor-led, which is 100% instructor interaction. That's one of the things that really sets them apart from other courses that you can take. For example, you can do quite a lot of courses online for coding and software engineering that are not instructor led and are maybe through like a learning platform. Whereas Codeclan stuff, whether it's remote or in person, they're fully instructor led. You can literally stop the instructor halfway through a lesson to ask a question, and if anything, that's actually encouraged. The whole course is designed to take someone who has very little experience all the way up to a junior software engineer, such that they're able to become a junior software engineer in an organization. And the course hits on all of the basics, mostly around Python, JavaScript, Java, but as well as that, the software engineering principles and all of the really important fundamentals behind software engineering and coding and clean code, that all gets taught in this interactive, immersive way at Codeclan. One of the other great things about Codeclan is that people often say, can I learn like Rust, or can I learn Swift or something like that? You actually can't like learn tons and tons and tons of things on the course, because there only is so much time, and you can only fit in so many like languages and skills. But one of the great things about it is that it gives you the ability to learn those things later on. It doesn't just say here's React and here's JavaScript and whatever else, and then off you go. The instructors that you get on Codeclan are so helpful, and they're so good at knowing exactly what people are thinking and feeling at various points in the course, because it is a very intensive course. But at least there's between 2 to 4 instructors per class, and that's for both remote classes and in-person classes. And everyone learns in the cohort at the same pace, which is excellent. It's really good to know that, for example, the way that they teach on the course, which is so important to me, the way that they teach is that they use a lot of what we called code alongs. And a code along is where an instructor kind of quite slowly and methodically codes out something in front of the class, whether it's on Zoom or in person in the classroom. And then the class slowly like code that thing together. We call that a code along. And that's actually a really powerful way to learn, because you're seeing the actual coding process happen in front of you, but you're also being taught at the same time. And as a participant, as a student, what you can actually do is you can stop and you can have a conversation and you can ask questions. Codeclan is kind of a life-changing thing. I've seen dozens and dozens and hundreds of people go through it in the time that I was there, and it was genuinely life-changing for every single one of them. They managed to get jobs as software engineers, junior software engineers in the industry. And even now, uh, being a couple of years ago that I worked there, I know many of the people I know are now mid-level, kind of senior level engineers. So it's having a huge impact on people's lives, and in a way that I couldn't even describe. It's pretty awesome. To get more information about Codeclan, go to codeclan.com and /events, codeclan.com/events, to learn more and to register for a workshop. The workshops that they do are kind of like a way of you figuring out if you want to come along to Codeclan and join up and do the course. And it's a really great way of figuring out if this is the sort of thing that's going to be useful to you. Please give it a try if you're thinking about it. I highly recommend it. It's absolutely fantastic, genuinely life-changing.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. As someone that learnt Dynamic first, so I learned JavaScript and Python basically off the bat, mainly JavaScript. Here's my only counter argument to that, because yes, I do think learning types is important. and it does help you with the fundamentals. Would you not say that with the advent of TypeScript becoming so popular in the last couple of years, that now JavaScript has static types that people can learn relatively easy alongside or even just after their JavaScript fundamentals? Would you not say that you can achieve the same thing by just learning TypeScript with JavaScript? Or would you say Java is still superior in that respect? And for people who aren't familiar, Java and JavaScript are very different, and we know it's confusing that their name's similar. Unfortunately, that decision was made when me and Colin were either not born or still in school. So please don't come at us.
I was in school. I was in primary 5. Yep. So, uh, I think I think it's really difficult to teach TypeScript to JavaScript beginners. Um, I've tried, and it's pretty tricky, and that's because TypeScript is pretty tricky, right? Like, I mean, it's easy to like do some basic TypeScript, but it's very difficult to do some advanced TypeScript. You'll know yourself anytime you like go to like import a library that has TypeScript stuff. Like sometimes understanding those types can actually be really complex. Like because it's usually heavily templated, which means it uses generics to say like, okay, this function or this object can take two types, and one is a T and one is a V or whatever, and those mean generics in the context of TypeScript. So I think it's really hard to teach TypeScript to complete beginners. I would only teach TypeScript to people who get JavaScript and have been doing a fair bit of JavaScript for a bit. So, and that's because TypeScript isn't and shouldn't be seen as a language in itself. It is not. It is an extension to JavaScript. So, like when I write TypeScript, I don't write TypeScript any different from how I write JavaScript. I basically write JavaScript and I sprinkle on some types, and it's then up to you, your team, the people you're working with to decide how much down that rabbit hole you wish to go. Like you might only want to like use it for a couple of things, and that's the kind of really cool thing about TypeScript. But yeah, that wasn't the question. Do you like TypeScript? The answer to that question is of course absolutely yes. I think it's awesome. The question was, should you teach TypeScript at the same time you're teaching JavaScript, and then that gives you the types? I would say actually no. Yeah, just from personal experience, and like they're not like one language in the same way that like C# is one language that has the types built in, and Java is one language that has the types built in, and Rust has one language that has the types built in, and insert statically typed language of choice here, C++, if you even feel as strongly about that as that. But yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and I think as well, to be honest, Java, Python, or JavaScript, you're going to be finding on a job market as well. I think whilst we're talking about the technical specifications of it, I think something that's a bit unique about the coder career is that each of us have spent a lot of time working with people that are getting their first or second jobs in tech. And I think something to really consider is how marketable the language is. And I think really with any of those three, you're going to be fine. I think it's when people start, like, for example, if you learn Rust off the back, which as your first language even, like, first off, you're gonna have a tough time, and second off, there's not many junior jobs using Rust out there, at least not that I've seen, and it's still fairly niche. I think I think the problem is particularly people that are quite plugged into the tech industry, and it's great if you are, and like you're listening to this podcast and you're following the right people, and you follow Dan Abramov on Twitter if you're a React developer, something like that, and you're plugged into the industry and you're thinking about what's the most cutting edge thing. That's awesome, but there's a very good chance your first job is going to be somewhere in a random town, working on a system that is 10 years old, and there's nothing wrong with that, and you'll learn some really good lessons from that, especially if you're having to migrate that system. However, you are not going to be using React 18, and you're not going to be optimizing things using Rust. It's important that you consider what's the most marketable language, both globally and then also as well within your area, particularly if you're in a market where remote work isn't the norm, is something really, really worth considering. Like if for whatever reason all the local companies around you use C# or even PHP, maybe that's what you have to learn. Like, I know I tell people regularly, don't learn PHP, but if that's the only jobs in your area and it's not usual to work remote where you're from, then learn PHP and then learn something else. What do you reckon?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've got a similar opinion on that. If we're dispensing advice, which obviously we often do in this podcast, it's kind of one of the reasons it exists. Then I would take a slightly different slant. While I mostly agree, I would say if you're picking a first language, which is kind of where we've ended going with this conversation, which I really love, then pick a first language that helps you understand programming. In my opinion, um, just from my experience of teaching people, that first language that you learn is really important to get your head around, because like if you don't pick up programming and how to solve problems using code and programming, solutions, then like no matter how many languages you compound on top of that, you're probably always going to struggle a bit, if that makes sense. So my advice is slightly different, and that is pick a language for your first program language that you think that you'll be able to understand really well and can get a lot of support with. And that's why for the most part people choose really popular languages, like, and they should do, like Python and even JavaScript and um Java. Like, people do pick it as a first programming language, just not as often as they should. I don't think, but um, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, like, not a great first language in my opinion, but that's just my opinion. Um, and
Whereas 7
yeah,
or 8 years ago, it would have been no, because it's so marketable. Although maybe not the best for the
no,
fundamentals.
no, I mean, I'm talking less. I'm from my opinion, like for my advice, um, is my personal advice is don't go for marketable. Go for something that you're going to be able to like completely understand the fundament. It's going to help you understand the fundamentals of programming, and um, and I guess marketable is definitely part of it. Like, for example, right? Like, I'm never going to say to someone, go and learn like go and I'm never going to go and say to someone, go and learn Rust as your first language, because that's bad. That's just generally bad advice, but that's because it's a really complex language and because it's not marketable to juniors, as you quite rightly said. But I'm also I'm also not the kind of person that would advise, like, let's say like next year, let's say next year, for example, Rust does become the like biggest programming language and it takes over everything, and it's like insanely popular and every job demands Rust. I would probably then still say, don't learn Rust as your first programming language,
Mm.
because it's complicated and it's difficult to, you're going to struggle to learn that as your first language, right? Like, which is kind of one of the reasons why there are more programmers now than there ever were, because years and years ago we only had languages like C++ and C. So if you imagine learning how to program in the like this the 80s, for example, when these languages existed, in the 90s, in the really early 90s, then it would be a lot harder to become a programmer because the programming languages were mega complex. So, like, I would say pick a language that you think that you're going to be able to learn, and you think that's going to give you like the fundamentals of programming and software engineering. And for my money and for my personal opinion, like, and we can all have our own like personal opinion on that, I think, which is really good. So you can take advice from a combination of both of us. Um, I think that something like Java gives you the whole package, right? It gives you the ability to understand what interfaces are. It gives you the ability to understand what certain types of object-oriented programming techniques are, like polymorphism. It lets you understand templates. It lets you understand like functional little bits and pieces as well, like streams, and it lets you understand so many different things that you're getting a lot of bang for your buck in terms of your learning as that first program language.
And if
So that's
people
what I
want to
think.
learn Java, I think you recommend Amigos Code, that or
Yes,
go to Codeclan, uh, who are
absolutely.
running events, and the podcast is brought to you by Codeclan. But if you want to taste it, you can go to one of their events. But as well, like if you're not in Scotland or not in the UK, because you can do Codeclan remotely, then yeah, Amigos Code I think is one you recommend, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, it's a good course. There's quite a few decent Java courses online, and like I think Java is actually really cool, and like I was going to chat a little bit about that as well. There's some really cool stuff happening in Java, and I think I'm very much like one of these people that like I'm actually a Java programmer. That's one of my big things, and I don't I'm not a fan of like this oh, this is the sexy language, and oh, and that's not a sexy language, because actually, like, it might sound, I don't think a lot of people agree with me on this, but Java is a really sexy language. There's some really cool stuff you can do with Java. So one of the biggest things in Java, for example, is a thing called Spring and Spring Boot, which is a massive framework that lets you do some really cool things, and it's very popular, and it's growing all the time. It's been around for quite a while. It does tend to be used more in places like banks and things, and that's maybe one of the reasons why Java gets a bit of a slightly bad rap on the opinion wise. I think it's because people see it in the bank and go, "Oh, it's like a bank language or whatever." But it does move very quickly. There's a lot of updates to Java, like, and there's a lot of really cool features going on. And Spring and Spring Boot are like very widely supported and really easy to like get into and understand. And one other really cool things that's happening about Java recently, just while we're talking about that, is a thing called GraalVM. Now, GraalVM is like mega cutting edge compiler technology, and what that lets you do is it lets you take a Java program and it lets you run it natively. Now, that might sound like, what's the big deal there? And the big deal there is actually that uh, just this a little bit, is actually that when you run a Java program, it actually doesn't run on your machine. It doesn't run on like it doesn't get compiled to what we call like a native assembly, like a native binary. It runs on the JVM, which is another program on your computer designed to run that. And that's got really big benefits like backward compatibility between different versions of Java, forward compatibility between different versions of Java. And it also means that things that that the JVM, it can run other languages too. So it's not just Java that runs in the JVM. So for example, the programming language Kotlin, which is getting a lot of popularity, runs on the JVM. So does Groovy, so does Scala, so does Clojure. There's tons and tons and tons of languages that compile to a thing called bytecode that then run on the JVM. So they run inside this app called Java Runtime, which runs on your computer. But so that's been really good because it's helped with like a lot of really cool progression in the Java ecosystem. But only now in the last like couple of years, there's been some really cool compiler technology invented called GraalVM that lets you then take your Java code and compile it all the way to a complete native binary. Um, and that's insane because that means that your Java app doesn't have to like run on the JVM anymore, and that means it's going to run so much faster, and it's going to run with a really small memory footprint, and it's going to use barely any RAM, and the most important thing is it's going to start like super fast. So I work with Spring Boot at work quite a lot, and Spring Boot applications tend to take to start it up. It tends to take between like 5 to 10 seconds, sometimes 30 seconds to like start a Spring Boot app, just because it's doing a lot of stuff and Spring Boot's got a lot going on. But you can basically run a Spring Boot app from zero to like ready to go, and that means like a big application in like a second or less with GraalVM. That's very cool. There's a lot of really cool stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of underrated innovation going on in something like Java. And as you say, Colin, like don't just think it's like a banking thing. Like both of us work for very cool companies that use Java heavily as our day jobs, and they're we're both working on really interesting stuff. I mean, you do a lot more back end stuff than me, but I see what the back end people are doing at my job, and it is very cool. I think we're sort of like reaching all we got time for today, though, and I want to say a massive thank you to Codeclan, and we're just so excited to be in a partnership with them now. As obviously as Colin knows, he's taught there, and it's an amazing place to study. So please do go and check that out. But thanks so much for everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for everyone. That's a really good chat, Cameron. Let's do this again.
Yeah, we should. We should do it every other week and release it on a Monday.
I'd like to know what people think of the format as well. So ping us a message on the Discord. If you're not on the Discord, join the Discord, thecodercareer.com/Discord. We'd love to hear your feedback on the podcast. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and we hope the video's gone off without a hitch. As Colin says, like, let us know the feedback both in terms of content and then anything technical as well. All right, cheers everyone.
Bye.